Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm John Ruggie, Director of the Center for Business and Government. It gives me very, very great and personal pleasure to welcome a friend and former colleague, Mark Malloch Brown, the head of the United Nations Development Program. I don't want to call you administrator. That's your formal title, but it just sounds so boring, and you're not a boring person, Mark. So I'm going to call you the head of the United Nations Development Program, who is going to speak to us this evening on the race to 2015, building a global campaign to fight poverty. If you go to the UNDP's homepage and look up Mark Malloch Brown's bio, the alliteration got to me there, you'll find a number of unusual features, all of which characterize Mark's extraordinary leadership of that organization. First, UNDP is described as the UN's global development network. Let me tell you from personal, professional experience that until very recently, the very idea of a network-based organization in the United Nations was an oxymoron and utterly unthinkable. Secondly, it will tell you that he has overseen extensive reforms in UNDP, making it, and I quote, more focused, efficient, and effective, unquote. Those are not words that roll off the tongue easily when one thinks of development agencies, whether international or national. Thirdly, you will learn that he views UNDP's major comparative advantage to be helping developing countries to achieve more effective governance, to better utilize information and communications technologies, and I know from personal experience of his efforts, to tap better into the capacities of the private sector, all of them being significant departures from past practices. Finally, it states that Mark is leading Kofi Annan's efforts to develop strategies for the implementation of the Millennium Development Goals, which I want to stress are the first set of common goals for the entire UN system, including the Bretton Woods institutions, in their entire history. It takes a strategic thinker, a charismatic leader, and an outstanding communicator to do all those things, and Mark is just that. Before coming to UNDP, he was Vice President for External Affairs at the World Bank. He's worked in the private sector as a consultant, and he got his start as a journalist for The Economist magazine. He graduated from university in the other Cambridge, but also managed to study at the University of Michigan. And on top of that, he's the proud father of 4 children. Please welcome Mark Malloch Brown. Thank you.
John, thank you very much. And I was not surprised to find I wasn't the first UN speaker to have stood at this podium in recent years. Some of us consider John to be the sort of UN's Boston liaison office. He's a wonderful colleague who has made a huge number of links between the world of Boston and particularly Harvard and the UN in New York. We were sorry to lose him, but if we had to come here and start building the way we can, I think, work together is something we're very pleased and proud of. So, thank you to everybody, to Dan Glickman and to the Dean of the Kennedy School, Joe Nye, for the invitation, and particularly to John and to Bill White for organizing and hosting this evening. I want to, before giving up entirely on John's point about my title as administrator being very dull, to just tell you where I got it from. And there are enough people here who know me to know that it certainly wasn't an award for having the skills an administrator should have, because many would observe that it's the one thing I'm probably not very good at doing, is administrating anything. My life, my office, my family, anything. I'm more on the creative end of things. But I got the title with the job because 50-some years ago, General George Marshall gave a commencement address here at Harvard calling for the Marshall Plan, whose first leader, its administrator, was Paul Hoffman, a distinguished American motor car executive, who, having fixed Europe with dramatic success by investing in today's terms some $100 billion in today's money in rebuilding Europe, was asked to do the same thing for the developing world and arrived with his title, the administrator, to head the new UNDP. Now, 40 years later, I still have the title and we still haven't fixed the developing world. The challenge of that seismic series of interventions which changed the course of Europe in the years after the Second World War have not yet been replicated in terms of development. But just what I want to talk about tonight is, in a sense, a new Marshall Plan. And I want to talk about it not in the tired way of we need a lot of extra development assistance and public investment in the developing world, a new Marshall Plan in that sense. No, I want to talk about it as an expression of organized political will and cooperation of the citizens of the United States and their government deciding that the security and stability of the post-war order was threatened by an inadequate investment in rebuilding Europe. And it's that sense of political purpose and response that I think we can take from the Marshall Plan analogy to dealing with global poverty today. And to think in the terms of what happened in Western Europe, where a dramatic turnaround was achieved. A very different context of institutions which have been hollowed out and destroyed or knocked down by war, but nevertheless institutions that could be rebuilt and repaired and put on a much stronger democratic, liberal foundation than before. But nevertheless, it was a task of rebuilding, and many would argue that some of the challenges in the developing world may, in that sense, be more fundamental of building the institutions of modern nation states where they perhaps don't exist. But whatever, in that sense, the difference is, perhaps what brings them together was that somebody listening to General Marshall here at Harvard immediately after the Second World War would have really had no idea how much the world he was talking about of Western Europe was about to change, would have had no idea of the European institutions which would flow and flower from the investment of the Marshall Plan. No idea that some 50 years later, countries already behind the Iron Curtain were not only going to re-emerge from it, but become part of a modern, liberal, tolerant, single Europe. In the same way, perhaps, that in 1988, Russians would have had no idea what was about to befall their region only a year later, of the profound change in institutions and economic arrangements which was so quickly to befall them. And I think perhaps you can use that point here tonight. I was talking to several of my colleagues who are students here at the Kennedy School this year and asking them where the focus of your studies are, and was told, well, it's still an awful lot on national government and an awful lot on security. Let me tell you, you're all studying the wrong subjects. Let me bet any of you who wish and who can find a way of calling me on this bet in 10 years' time, you will have made the wrong career choices if you follow that direction in your post-Harvard careers. That is not where the action is going to be. we are on the eve of the emergence of an entirely new set of institutions to address the global issues that shape our times. I do not think, just as we could not have told a Russian in 1988, or if we had sought to say to him, look, communism is going to be replaced by some clean democratic capitalism with a nice welfare reform system to sustain it, we would have been misleading the Russian, even if we'd had the vision to understand how quickly his society or her society was going to change. And similarly, I have no idea what exact form these global institutions are going to take. But where I sit, the pieces are starting to move. The UN system is under dramatic strain, not because of the failure of Iraq, but because of the huge demands put on it. That little stuffy Security Council chamber is arguably the world's best known room now. For month after month, television audiences around the world we're not watching national political debates, but following the debate in the Security Council. And let me tell you, a year after that war, almost, the overall verdict of that council doesn't look bad either, in terms of its view as to whether weapons of mass destruction would be found or wouldn't, and whether or not there was therefore a case for an urgent and imminent war. But the point is, whatever the institutions, the issues are driving towards a reorganization of the international system. Because there's a new political economy out there, shaped and certain to be shaped, just as coming out of Western Europe, there were idealists who took the hard issues of steel and iron, the founding economic sectors of the European community, and laid on top of economic self-interest an idealistic structure of European cooperation. And those idealists will no doubt be part of designing the new global governance arrangements, which I suspect we're on the eve of finding. But there will be more than outnumbered by reactive pragmatists who will be as moved by the threats as they are of the opportunities of the world we're living in. The threats that clearly form so much part of your class discussions. The need evidently for a new security system when the most powerful country in the world feels as vulnerable as America does today. There's something wrong with the international collective security system. When Westerners everywhere feel threatened by health problems in very different corners of the world, whether it's the pandemic of HIV/AIDS or SARS or its different flu forms that we're now seeing, there is a huge, incessant, growing demand for a better managed, better policed global health system. As we struggle with the challenge of immigration, with different countries increasingly adopting illiberal, restrictive controls on the movement of people into their societies, we are facing a problem that can no longer be dealt with at the national level. It is impossible to sustain, and this is a case for a lecture in its own right, but it's impossible to sustain a model of liberal globalization with the free movement of ideas, services, goods, finance, and believe that you can combine it with a ever more restrictive system of movement of people. So across all these issues, there are threats, and behind all of them lies the greatest threat of all for many, the problem of failed states, housing terrorist movements, nurturing them, allowing them to grow and pose a threat way beyond the borders of that failed state itself. And clearly, the new international structures we build will be shaped by responding to those threats. But they will also be shaped by responding to new opportunities. It's, I think, clear to many of your colleagues at the Harvard Business School as to their counterparts across the business school community at the moment, that probably the markets that many of you who make your careers in the private sector will spend your lives in are not the markets of North America or Western Europe or Japan, but the market where 2/3 of the world live, the 4 billion people living on $1,500 a year, or in many cases very much less. And the challenge of the companies that many of you may choose to work for will be building business models which allow them to sell affordable services and products into those markets. Because that is where both spending growth and population growth is going to take place. Broad markets, shallow markets, certainly, but markets where companies seeking new opportunities will increasingly focus their efforts. But it's not just a matter of economics taking us beyond traditional countries and markets that we know well. It's perhaps above all an issue of values taking us on that journey. We, after all, are several generations represented in this room who've seen the rise of the environment movement, a huge emphasis in our thinking about economics and other issues on sustainability, the need to live within our means in terms of resources, particularly energy and to a lesser extent water. It's also the human rights era, where our own sense of citizenship requires us to be outraged and take political action for human rights abuses abroad. There is no sense that our concern and faith as people who believe in the basic right to a decent life for all, that is limited to what we do as voters in our own countries. It's reflected in us being contributors to organizations like Amnesty International and others. And it's above all, of course, an issue, if you like, that we are generations who have a global culture of curiosity. We're passionate about things happening in other places. And if anything, many of us, and I say this particularly to the Westerners in the room, are rather disappointed and bored of what happens at home. It doesn't turn us on politically. Speaking for my own country, Britain, the main opposition party, the Conservatives, have today many few paid-up members than major NGOs in that country. I suspect if you looked and took liberal definitions of major NGOs here in America and backed out union members and other automatic members of political parties here, you would find that certainly in terms of the rate of growth, and if you looked at the demographics, the attraction of younger voters is much more to participation in civil society organizations with an international agenda than it is to domestic political parties. And if that is the case, it's part of a phenomenon across the whole Western world. I'm a former political consultant and advisor, and I love to point out after elections to European politicians how they actually won a critical slice of the demographic vote, typically young professionals, by being good on development issues. For the first time in the political lifetime of most of us, development is a vote winner. Human rights is a vote winner. It's gone from a matter of conscience to a matter of real politics. And so I think in all kinds of ways our societies are changing their boundaries, and like that Russian in 1988, we just don't realize the tide of change which is about to sweep over us in terms of how we're governed, how we think about the issues that affect our lives, and what we demand of the institutions that manage those issues that shape our lives. And let me just say that the final element of it is that we've just failed in an extraordinary way to understand the momentum of change across the developing world. We so much see it through the prism of development failures and scandals, of dams built that didn't work, of a failure of environmental suitability and sustainability in the development activities of the 80s, the politicization of aid for so long behind different Cold War competitive groupings, that we've lost sight of the extraordinary things that have happened over the last quarter and a half century. In the last quarter of the 25 years, we've seen a doubling of the size of the world economy, and a significant and growing portion of that coming from the non-OECD countries. Perhaps even more critically, we've seen a doubling of the number of democracies in the world, so that democracy has become the majority form of government in the world. Imperfect, poor, shallow in many countries, but still the preferred method of government. If we go back 50 years, we see dramatic strides in the quality of life for people around the world. 50 years ago, there were less than 400 million people who could read and write in developing countries. Today, there are 2.6 billion. In that same period of time, life expectancy has increased by more than in the whole of recorded history till that point. There have been dramatic changes, which again shape the fundamental moment of change that I think we're at in terms of development and how we handle it, and more broadly, how we handle global issues. So in a funny kind of way, I think you all here at a school like this and in a community like this represent, in more than the sort of tired phrase it sounds like, a global generation where whatever you choose to do, and I think this is the key point, I don't expect you all to go and work for the UN. I'm going to in a moment just remind you how small the UN is. But whether you work in government, whether you work in the corporate sector, whether you work in the growing global civil society, that whatever you do, the issues of your working career will be global, not national. And your institutions will be struggling to matter at the global level. Too much of what matters to their success will no longer be issues that can be resolved and determined at the national level alone. And again, I want to be clear, I have no crystal ball. I am very uncertain in my own mind what this new globally managed world will look like. I know that the current UN is hardly equipped to play that role. That when you take all of the UN agencies and entities, leaving out for a moment our sisters, the World Bank and the IMF, and the other international development banks, we spend about $12 billion a year. That's less than New York City's education budget. It's 1/10 of the European Union's budget. The World Health Organization, tasked with eliminating the key infectious diseases in the world, annually spends less than what it costs to build a new basketball hockey facility in Dallas, Texas. If you look at the staffing of these key organizations, and now include in the World Bank and the IMF, we're about 61,000 of us globally. Well, you know, that's less than the US federal government employs abroad. And of course, a fraction of what it employs at home. It's less than the city of Vienna has on its payroll. It's less than the staff of Disneyland and Disney World combined. So in other words, the real people doing global stuff employ less than those running the theme park about global stuff. It's quite a comment on the unevenness of the global system at the moment. But it won't be replaced by just a UN, a monolithic mega UN, some many multiples of size of what it is at the moment. I think instead it's going to be replaced by a network-based, issue-based way of handling global affairs, where you're going to see a much more enlightened corporate sector which recognizes that issues of social responsibility, issues of justice, in this new market of the poor 4 billion that it wants to penetrate, make it as much a force that in that context its social actions will account as much as its traditional entrepreneurial actions in terms of building market share. And I really welcome, John, the new initiative on corporate social responsibility that you and Jane Nelson are launching, I think, in early March. I think on the NGO side, which has seen a huge explosion of growth, with some 20,000 now transnational NGO networks and some 37,000 international NGOs, that will grow and grow and grow around handling these kinds of issues. But and I do think that in a sense, this growth of international structure, whatever form it takes, formal or informal, as with my own suspicion being that it'll be much more the latter, it needs a manifesto. And here I come back to that Marshall Plan, because the manifesto for now is the Millennium Development Goals. Let's be very clear in a sense what those MDGs are. They offer the same kind of will and direction and purpose and political organizing point and public policy focus that the Marshall Plan provided. They offer the same opportunity for leadership, that effort to just go out and make the case that global poverty is a threat to global stability and to global prosperity, that a globalized world economy just cannot sustain these kinds of levels of inequality, and that whether you're a corporate chief, a political leader, or an NGO activist, it matters to each of you as much that this kind of inequity, if left unresolved, doesn't remain in some kind of stable state. It tips very quickly into higher levels of political frustration and instability, and certainly threatens that security agenda that you've all studied so much here. And it is, in that sense, very simply a social contract that amounts to globalization's dividend for the poor. Unless globalization can be shown to make this kind of significant, quick impact in terms of poverty reduction, access to basic education and healthcare, tackling pressing problems which are the real security agenda for most of the world today, the risk of HIV/AIDS, the issue of environmental degradation and loss of livelihood, unless on those basic pocketbook voting issues for these poor new Democrats in developing countries across the world, unless we can deliver on that, then globalization, the liberal world order of which it's an expression, all is jeopardized. And I just think that in that sense, while we will, all of us in this room, find careers in very different places, we are going to find ourselves part of a single conversation, which is how do we, as corporates, or as global citizens, finding our careers in very different parts of a global system, nevertheless combine with a common purpose and sense of urgency, a sense that in a very real way, the real direction of this century is going to be determined in the next few years. Either we get this problem licked, and I think we know how to do it, and there are some people in this audience who are working very closely with me on making sure we do know how to do it. If we don't get it licked, the costs to stability and prosperity are enormous. And that's why, again, if I can give you all a piece of career advice, less of those security courses, less of that study of how the federal government works, and a bigger focus on this dramatic, exciting, revolutionary agenda, which is both the opportunity and threat of our time, which is, do we all, not just in your working lives, but mine too, end the real scourge of global poverty as we know it. Thank you.
Mark, thank you very, very much for those inspiring remarks. I remember Kofi Annan once saying that the most important decisions that he made were which people to appoint to what posts. and what a great job he did in picking his administrator for the UN Development Program. I just want to add a little addendum to your last remark, Mark, and that is that people who have the understanding or develop the understanding that you have of the challenges go forth and multiply also in the federal government of the United States. So we're going to take questions now and invite Mark to respond. I think most know the rules of the game here. Please state who you are, which school you are from. Questions in this forum have a question mark at the end, and they are always brief. And we usually start on the floor, but we're going to break with tradition today and start up in the bleachers. And then, Mark, you can do the rest. We'll just rotate around, okay? Whatever you prefer, whatever you like. Okay, please.
Hi, I'm Faryal from the Graduate School of Education here, and it's very exciting to hear of the merging global governance institutions. But what I'm not hearing is the relationship between the global, the national, and the local. And my question is, unless we don't focus on these relationships that the local informs the global, are we really meeting our challenges in this era of globalization?
Should we take a couple more questions and then?
So, yeah,
Sorry.
there's 4 mics.
Sure.
I'm Nathan Rosenberg. I'm a junior at the college. My question was similar. We often have a debate about what to do in a given country, but then there's a second obstacle of actually making it happen. And I was wondering what you see as the role as the UN in relationship to NGOs, the local government. What role should the UN Development Program be playing in implementation of policy?
Yes, Krishna Guha, I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. I wanted to ask about the MDGs. It seems, of course, as enough of a stretch target to meet the goals in aggregate. But it seems that a far more difficult challenge is actually to ensure that the very worst performing countries, the countries with the weakest governance systems and so on, are able to actually progress in an era where more mutual accountability is being demanded. And I wanted to really I invite you to explore your thoughts about how we ensure that no one is actually left behind.
Let me take those as the first 3, if I may. And I think they're excellent, and this issue of the global, national, and local is enormously important. If it had been more than 25 minutes, we'd have got to it. So I'm glad we are now, because you have to understand that these Millennium Development Goals, I mean, John is very modest, but the man who actually wrote them down and said this is something that we should distill from the conferences of the 90s, Rio on the environment, Beijing on women, and distill them was John, and this was a piece of genius, which I hope he will be acknowledged for. But I, who sort of sat around with John on long evenings trying to think how to frame this Millennium Assembly of 2000 where this happened, for me there were long echoes, because I earned my living for many years doing polls in developing countries and helping the opposition leaders or the presidents of those countries derive a political and governing strategy from that. And these issues of the MDGs were what I saw in poll after poll. People wanting these basic pocketbook things for themselves and their families. Basic health, basic opportunity of education for their kids, jobs, a little bit of prosperity, some opportunity, an honest government which wasn't corrupt. And I think we've retired the polling industry at a stroke, in fact, because these MDGs have a universal political power in poor countries. Obviously, issues differ, priorities differ. So one thing that we have done, which is the base to all this effort, is that we're not envisaging a UN campaign for these goals. We're envisioning people demanding this of their governments, particularly their elected governments. So we have started this annual reporting with local civil society and governments on how countries are doing. And let me tell you, the rows that are developing where this reporting is exposing that one gender is doing better than the other, or that one region or ethnic group is doing better than another, or that a country with a higher per capita income than its neighbor is doing less well on the goals. The political power of this, the ability to lead table and rank your government or your local government and to demand better of it, is, in my mind, is the second shoe dropping with the extension of the democratic franchise. I use the example of Britain, where people got the vote and they still went on talking about the Kaiser and warships for a decade. And then suddenly, social reformers started benchmarking poverty in the English cities. And people said, why? We've got the vote. Why should we put up with this? And out of that came the Labour Party and the welfare state and much else. But I hope that with these MDGs we can seed that same kind of bottom-up political anger and demand. There's a risk to it, because democracy in so many countries is now the incumbent. And where it fails to deliver, as is happening in much of Latin America today, where there are not reductions of inequality, where the growth of the 90s did not translate into significant reductions in poverty, then you have a real risk that democracy itself is in some ways jeopardized. But I think what we're creating here is the vital link between democracy and accountable government and what you want from government, which is results, a better life for me and my family. And so building from that, we're obviously trying to construct this sort of global league tabling system where you can see what it takes. And if I could then just say where that takes us to the global level, is that next year in New York, we will, at a head of government level, have a 5-year review of where are we going on the Millennium Declaration. And working with Calestis Juma and many other colleagues, we are going to put governments' backs to the wall as they've never had them put to the wall before. This will be a very different kind of UN meeting, because we've had 250 specialists, academics, led by an old Harvard man, Jeff Sachs, working to really work out both on the global issues of the MDGs, but also on the country up costing and policy issues, what it will take to meet the goals. There will be nowhere for governments to run next year. It will be costed, it will be clear, it will represent a consensus as much as possible of the different governments and development institutions, north, south. We are going to expose very clearly leaders who in 2000 signed up to these goals, to the challenge, we're off track, these are the things you need to do to get back on track. And there will be no doubt, no room for muddle and fudge as to whether they've done it or not. Have they made the concessions to get a trade round back on track on agriculture? Have the price of drugs dropped for key diseases? Is ODA at a sufficient level? All of it will, I think, be exposed in a way never before. And so I think we are going to move in a quite dramatic way from the local to the national to the global to gird and galvanize an effort of a, I hope, dramatic kind. And of course, in terms of the Millennium Development Goals in the weakest countries, it is going to be a huge problem. Because, you know, our Human Development Report of last year said that on current trends, Africa would only meet the goal of halving poverty by 2147, rather than 2015, which is what the goal calls for. In Asia, we may actually, both in East and South Asia, meet the goal before 2015 on current trends. But on other goals, environment, girls' education, clean drinking water, it's not very promising there either. So there's a lot to kind of push and gird and shake governments to get right between now and then. But you know, our own view is that, you know, even in the more difficult regions, which tend to be smaller, landlocked countries, so significantly Africa, but also the Andean region of Latin America, small island states in the Pacific and elsewhere, key landlocked parts of Central Asia. In these regions, where it's location much more than any other variable which really seems to determine outcomes. Even there, the right kind of strategies to build sub-regional markets, to build the infrastructure to allow those markets to operate, the right kind of policy reforms to generate much higher rates of growth in these economies, supported by the right kind of investment in social service provision, means that no country need get left behind. This is in the power of national and global policymakers to change the outcome, but to change it significantly by 2015, because this is a hell of a big tanker to move in the ocean, development trajectories, it's got to kind of move next year. And so I think you're going to see the politics of all this coming to a head over the course of the next 12 to 18 months. Sorry.
Maggie Asdibi-Katz, a student at the Kennedy School. We talk about the Millennium Development Goals and about this new emergence of global governance. I was wondering if you could comment on whether and how that will change the dynamic between developed and developing countries, because it seems like an opportunity to revisit that relationship.
Should we take that? We'll take another round, so we'll...
Eleanor Thompson, I'm a junior at the college, and I'm wondering, even if you develop a world of global citizens as opposed to national citizens, how are you going to solve the problem of people with westernized ideas and with a democratic outlook going into countries where democracy has essentially failed, and the civil society groups from which you're taking the polls are also politicized? And I guess my question is, can you concretely get to the grassroots level or reach people on the ground, because the people who you think you're talking to might also be part of the problem?
Okay.
My name is Mihai. I'm a student at the Extension School, and my question is that viewing the idealistic nature of international law and its lack of applicability, as we have seen recently in cases like Iraq, what role will it play in political scene of nation building?
Thank you. I'm Prabal Chakrabarti. I work for a Harvard-founded group on competitiveness. My question is about what the UNDP and civil society can do about countries that are facing a sort of a slow decline. They're not in a crisis, but yet there's not many strong signs of hope either, particularly with respect to rule of law and governance. A place like Kyrgyzstan or Uzbekistan or Armenia, especially in the former Soviet world.
Well, first, on the point about developing country cooperation, I think it's going through, it's one of those sort of not yet fully visible dynamics of change that we're seeing. The G8 is, it's a nice institution, but it's increasingly a little bit of a museum piece, in that, while it still represents a hugely dominant slice of the global economy, what's becoming increasingly clear is that even when the G8 wants to get something done globally, it creates so many antibodies by being a G8 exclusive decision that other groups just resist. So you're seeing the emergence of the G20, an effort to centered on the finance ministers initially, which brought together major developing country economies as well as developed country economies. And, it is proving a much better forum if you really want to get decisions that will stick. And so I think you're going to see that. You're also seeing the emergence of sort of rival groupings, a G3 now, which we are very involved with, of Brazil, India, and South Africa, which is in a sense giving the G8 a bit of a run for its money. And when you stop and say, who's done more, the G3 or the G8 to reduce global poverty? Perversely, the argument is the G3, because India, Brazil, and South Africa, but particularly in that grouping India and Brazil at this stage, and particularly if you were to then add China and call it a G4, those countries, through internal policies, have reduced poverty much more than the international ODA, development assistance of G8 members. So, you know, in a sense, the structures and the claims that are made for these old structures are losing ground as the real development reality is more complex. And you now see a country like India essentially saying, thank you very much, we don't want that much more development assistance. We'll take only very small amounts around key kind of qualitative issues in our country, but we plan to become a major donor ourselves in a South-South model of cooperation. So a lot is changing in this world, which the names and titles haven't entirely kept up with. On the issue of, you know, the westernization of democracy, if you like, I mean, you know, I've been in this business for too long to believe that democracy is some simple palliative that is easily applied and solves every problem of every developing country. I also have been in it too long to believe that the American or British model is necessarily a transferable or applicable one. But what I do think is highly universal is accountable institutions, which really do respond to people. What I think is highly universal is a rule of law that treats all equally. What is highly universal are the core human rights, the rights of women and other groups. And these issues are not Western, they're universal. And I think, you know, we need to sort of keep that in mind, because while there, of course, are cultural filters that good development agencies have to work their way through and understand and respond to and listen very hard to, and not be instantly prescriptive and too much driven by our own cultural experience from what we come. We also must not fall into such a sort of tentative cultural relativism that we forget that freedom, political and economic, are things that people everywhere want. They'll give it their own form and shape, but these are not something that, in a sense, are imposed. And that then, of course, brings us to this issue of nation building and international law. It's, you know, rule of law is at the heart of successful post-conflict nation building. People have entered into conflict with their neighbors and rival ethnic or social or regional groups, more often than not because they feel they can't get justice under the system in which they're operating. And therefore, building justice as a first building block to restoring trust between war-torn communities is absolutely critical, and it's one of the most difficult things to do. It's easy to get a bunch of retired judges to go and, you know, offer their own models of justice, but to understand local justice systems, to build them into a system which combines traditional justice methods with a minimum international method, to put it in forms which allow it to be used by people who have local languages. All of this is, you know, an issue of tremendous difficulty that we are wrestling with. And of course, this issue of slow decline in Central Asia, but other regions as well, is critical. And, you know, we have a sense of countries which are not exposed enough to the global economy, not driven by the changes taking place more broadly, where elites are still able to hold a grip on power, and even if there are some of the forms of more open institutions, the reality is they're still controlled. And I think more broadly, given that you raised Central Asia, we have to understand that rhetoric that in no small part emanated from this institution about the liberalization that followed the fall of the communist Soviet Union in 1989 has disguised a chronic crisis of social indicators. This point about democracy being more authoritarian in Russia, I was there last week, is evidently very true, but I would argue even more alarming is that today our Human Development Index is much lower for Russia than it was in 1989. that male life expectancy in Russia has now dropped to below 60. No wonder democracy, the incumbent, is under threat, because it's not delivering the social and economic goods. And the West doesn't want to know, because after all, there was a democratic, free market reform in Russia, wasn't there? Of course people should be better off and be modern Western consumers, and it's a disconcerting fact that Russia's social services and quality of life is worse today than it was in 1989 for most Russians.
Hi, I'm Victoria Salinas, and I'm from the Kennedy School. As you're probably aware, as one of your co-sponsors is the International Bridge Building Conference that has brought 7 grassroots leaders from around the world to be here with us this whole week, and many are in the audience tonight. To them, much of what you've talked about, being global citizens, global change, is not their issue, because they're very much focused on the national levels, their community issues. What advice can you give to Evaristo, for example, from Zambia, who cannot get sufficient government support for his home-based AIDS initiative because of tribal politics? Or Amanda from El Salvador, who is working on women's issues, but whether or not the government of El Salvador looks at its index and sees, oh, wow, we need to improve our gender equality, it doesn't really matter in her reality. Since they're here with us, could you please give them some operational advice in terms of how to really get these ideas you've spoken about in action in their own communities? Because they aren't just the nebulous grassroots local level, they're people trying to do exactly what you've spoken to.
But, no, I think it's very important, but I think I have given them some very practical advice, which is use the fact that Zambia did throw out a president who they're now sending to jail for corruption because of the strengthened democratic institutions there. Use the fact that, similar dramatic change has happened in the government of El Salvador with elections coming up and likely to be volcanic changes because of it. I think you have to understand as a civil society leader that on the one hand you're alone, and on the other hand you're part of a global movement. Alone, you are often very frustrated and very powerless about how to fix that problem of better support from national government. Part of a movement which is holding government to account for its performance, which has found a way of tying the president's political future to how his government performs on these issues, is key. And I actually don't think this global league tabling is at all irrelevant to their lives. I think it's hugely, hugely relevant because the fact is, you have to use political action. What is so different from this to earlier efforts to secure development progress is this isn't about international conferences. This is about exposing countries and regions within countries every year to the spotlight of their own citizens, being able to hold them up to the comparative of how they're doing versus countries next door. So it's saying to civil society leaders such as those with you this week, which is be political, act politically. Zambia is a very different country to when it had a president who'd been in office for 20 years. His successor is now on his way to jail. And the guy who's president now has to take great care to make sure that he is to enjoy a happy retirement on his farm by making sure that he's delivered results to people. And I think that's what this is about. It's making poverty political.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And I should have properly said, a thank you to all those leaders who are here with us on this. Thank you.
Nuno Santos, international development student at the Kennedy School. You mentioned 2 related issues to the Millennium Development Goals, namely going from local to global, and also the fact that you can put governments against the wall or sometimes pressure them for reforms, etc. My question goes on the opposite. How about global to local? And if you could comment on the issue of donor coordination, namely something that would appear to be easy or easier to do, and sometimes doesn't happen in terms of coordinating policies and reforms in these countries. And namely, if you, for example, you could comment on the World Bank and UNDP and their roles, which sometimes the relationship seems at the country level more informal than anything else.
Okay, we'll take.
My question is along the same line. Actually, I'm Barry Newstead. I'm at the Kennedy School as well. One of the challenges I think the international community, the global institutions face is a credibility issue. I think you talked about the problems of the 80s. I think we could talk about the crises of the 90s. And the fact that the community tended to create standard solutions. And it was very much New York or Washington saying this is the solution for everybody. And I think there's been a loss of trust in the ability of those institutions to diagnose. And I'm wondering, internally within the UNDP, how are you trying to reorganize the way your organization works analytically and gets a much better handle on what is going on locally versus, global fad type solutions?
Hi, Judith Olson. I'm a graduate of the Kennedy School and at the Episcopal Divinity School right now. My two quick questions are, one, when you talked about Russia, you talked about some of the failures there, and I'm wondering how you approach this seemingly pervasive bias that the free market system will solve all our development problems. And secondly, I know you've been a strong initiator, along with John Ruggie, in terms of corporate partnerships. And I wonder if you could speak to the issue of how corporate partnerships can be both expanded and also held more accountable, particularly through the Global Compact process.
Great. Well, look, first on the donor coordination, I mean, I think, in a sense, donor coordination, a lot of it is a sort of half-pregnant issue of still based on a vision of development, which is different powerful external aid agencies getting their own act together in order to tell governments what to do. And we're clearly moving towards a model of development cooperation where governments, accountable to their own people, accountable to their civil society, set the agenda, and international organizations respond to that agenda. And until we've kind of finished that transition to a much more nationally owned, driven kind of development cooperation where I think going to go on having these difficulties. Having said that, these have been 4 years of extraordinary sort of institutional reform on both sides with a combination of the two institutions you mentioned, the World Bank and UNDP, around a common set of instruments, poverty reduction strategies as means to implement Millennium Development Goals. And we don't always agree on the right strategy. We tend to show us a problem and we want to spend a lot of money. The bank may sometimes be more cautious as a financial institution, but the fact is it's a debate organized around the same issues between and is under the leadership of the local government. So I think a lot has shifted on that. The next question, I mean, in a sense, so how are we analytically organized to kind of understand that there are not cookie-cutter approaches to development? There is a local circumstances which determine so much. Well, we become a highly decentralized organization, not just we have 136 country offices around the world, but we have sub-regional centers where we've assembled our expertise and linked them together through a knowledge management architecture, so that we are really trying to learn best practice, learn local circumstance, and be a very knowledge-based, results-focused, learning organization. And I think it's really making a tremendous difference in terms of the results we achieve. On the point of Russia and free market biases, yeah, I mean, there is a pervasive free market bias, which, here in North America, which has, driven development in particular directions. I would kind of argue that sometimes in Europe we're a bit guilty of the other extreme, which is believing that state-based services can also be the basis of successful development. The fact is nobody gives enough space in official development for civil society. Nobody is focusing enough on small and medium-sized enterprise creation in developing countries as the basis for really enduring jobs and prosperity for the poor. And so I think we've got to get towards a more balanced vision. And within it, there is a real role for corporate partnerships. You have to start by recognizing what corporations are in business to do, which is make profits, and not be shocked by that, not believe that that is antithetical to good development, but to recognize that in the pursuit of good profits, in the kind of markets we're talking about, they need to demonstrate that they are social investors, that they will help build local partners, service providers, parts providers often, but above all, partners who can help address the needs of their customers and workforce, partners who can help provide the basics of education, health, clean water, energy, the other necessities to build these markets where they wish to operate. So, I believe there is a huge role for the private sector to play in all of this. I think I have to stop the questions there. Perhaps I should, just as a closing word on my side, say two things. One, a word in praise of governments. I don't want to be misunderstood, and John's in a sense corrected for me. I do think governments are a critical link in the chain. I do not think that global governance is going to replace national government. Strong national authorities are critical to protecting the rights of people in a global political economy. It's just that functions shift as to what needs to be handled at an extra governmental dimension and what is handled at the national level. And the other thing I want to do is say a word in praise of people, in that I may sound as though I'm talking global institutions, although I was very careful to talk global networks and issues, not the growth of some vast set of new global governance institutions. But what it's really about is people such as yourselves, feeling this sense of the tectonic plates of the world shifting under us, and that creating opportunity in whatever we do in our professional lives to be part of that global conversation, part of promoting that global agenda, because the opportunity is there to do it. My 250 experts working with Jeff Sachs rather shocked me when at the end of the first year of their work they came back to me and said, well, we found no silver bullets to solve the development problem. We want to tell you it's actually straightforward. It's political will. If people wanted to meet the Millennium Development Goals and organized to meet them from the community and therefore through the leaders here, through the bridge builders here tonight, through to the nation, to the global, these goals could be met. There is no barrier of science or economics to prevent them being met. Now, I was rather upset that I'd paid these expensive academics for a year or so to be told something that I, as a politician, could have told them at the beginning. But in a sense, it was an expensive vindication of a view that it is you who are going to make the difference. And you have to, in that sense, organize upwards, but organize politically. No more heroic, isolated, lonely civil society leaders. Recognize you're part of a global movement and act politically, because this level of global inequality and poverty should be unacceptable to all of us. Ethically, certainly, politically, certainly, but in terms of the future of our century, definitely. Thank you.
Mark, many thanks for being here with us and for inspiring us all. I think the bad news is that the challenges that we face as a human family are enormous. The good news is that we are making progress. We couldn't have had this conversation 5 or 6 years ago. We didn't have the vocabulary. We didn't have the concepts. And we didn't have leaders like my friend Mark Malloch Brown. Please join me again in thanking him.
Sports Credit Agency, in terms of development aid, they far